Asatoma Satkamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayeti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. So we begin today and in the next 2 Sundays a different text, a little break from our study of the Gita, in order to prepare ourselves for Durga Puja, which we will celebrate on the last Sunday of this month. So since we have 3 Sundays before that, I thought this would be a good opportunity for us to reflect a little bit on a very important text in the goddess tradition. Every year in the fall, a new season begins, and in many religious circles, we also sometimes call it as the mother season, because it's during this part of the year that many pujas directed to the divine in a feminine form are celebrated. So first we have the Durga Puja. It's very quickly followed then by Lakshmi Puja. Then in many parts they also celebrate the worship of another form of the Divine Mother called Jagadhatri. Then of course we have Kali Puja, which we celebrate in Boston as well. And then this culminates finally towards the end of the year in the worship that we have of Sharda Devi, the Holy Mother. So all these different pujas offered to the divine, but one common factor in all these different forms of the divine that are worshipped is that they are all feminine. Historically, the worship of God as a feminine power, a feminine being, often the mother, is very old. They have found archaeological artifacts which point to some kind of mother worship, some kind of goddess worship as far back as 5,000 to 6,000 years. So the mother tradition, the divine mother tradition, is so old. But the book that today has become very central to the tradition in many ways is called the Devi Mahatmyam. Now, in its present form, the book probably was written sometime in the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era. Although what we find, the descriptions given in it, the traditions that are brought together in it are much older than that. It is believed that this text originated somewhere in the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent, where it was known as Devi Mahatmyam, the glory of the Devi. And then very quickly, the tradition and the text traveled toward the east, and in Bengal, in many eastern parts of India, the same text became more popularly known as the Chandi. And then when it came down south, the southern part of the Indian subcontinent, it became known as the Durga Saptashati. Now Saptashati, Sapta is 7, Shati is 100. So this text has 700 verses, and so there were 700 verses addressed to Mother Durga. So the same text with at least 3 different names: Devi Mahatmyam, Chandi, or Durga Saptashati. The text itself has three distinct sections in which the goddess in her three forms is adored, and there are three stories connected with each of the sections. And so what we will do is today we will take the first section of the book. Next Sunday we will do the second section, and a Sunday after that we will do the third section. The story, the entire story as given in this text, begins with a king. His name is Suratha. So the book tells us that the king had a vast kingdom. He was very good. He took care of all his subjects, and everything apparently was going fine until there was an attack. Some people got together, some enemies came, and there's a story connected with it. They attacked some hill tribes, and enemies started creating. And so there was a division of the kingdom. The people he saw as his own supporters, as his own defendants, they turned against him. So much so that most of his kingdom was lost, except that one particular city where the capital was there. And even there he found then that some people were plotting against him. He became so unhappy, so disillusioned, so frustrated, so dejected that he just wanted some space for himself. He just wanted to just think calmly about the whole situation. And so we read that he took his horse and rode into the forest. He went deep into the forest until he came near a hermitage. And that was the hermitage of a sage called Medhas. So beautiful, quiet area, just as we find the Vedic hermitages described in ancient books. And so the king was at once felt, this is a quiet place. I think I need to just stop here and find some peace. And so he gets down from his horse and starts walking around in the premises of that hermitage. It is there that he meets another gentleman. And that other gentleman was a merchant. And his name was Samadhi. Now, we have often heard the word Samadhi, something that many of us as spiritual seekers would like to have. So he also lands there, and then the king asks him, who are you and what brings you here? And the merchant had his own story to tell. So it turned out that he was very wealthy. He came from a very wealthy family, but so much wealth he had, but his own family, his wife and his children, they turned against him. They tried to disinherit him from his own money. They tried to grab all the wealth to himself. And he was, again, just like the king, he just couldn't believe this betrayal by his own people, betrayal by the people he saw as his own. And he got this dejected. And then he came away again to find solitude and some peace deep into the woods. And that's when he also lands in the same place, in the hermitage of this sage called Medhas. And so here are these two kindred souls. The king, who is practically lost all of his kingdom by the betrayal of his people. And here is this merchant who has come away betrayed by his family. Now, this is not something uncommon. We hear about these things in different forms throughout history. Some of it may have happened in some form in our own lives as well. Some experience of betrayal, some experience of misfortune. But what was interesting also, that not only were these people dejected and frustrated and wanted to get away, but after coming away, the king now, while he is wandering around in this hermitage of the sage, began to think about what was happening back in his kingdom. He had a very favorite elephant, and he was thinking, oh, now that I've come away and all these enemies who have taken over my kingdom, what may have happened to my dear elephant? I hope they are feeding him well. Then he started thinking about those people in his court who he had earlier seen as his dear ones, as his friends. And he was thinking, now the same people who at one time praised me and made me think that they were my friends, now they are probably doing the same thing to their new master. So the more he wanted to get away from that environment and those people, physically he had come away, but mentally, psychologically, he was still thinking about those very people. And something similar was happening to the merchant as well. Although he was betrayed by his family, but still the bonds of attachment were so strong that even after being betrayed by them, he was still thinking about them. He was still thinking, oh, I hope that they won't misuse the money that I have collected, the business that I have built up so well, that these people won't just destroy it by their thoughtlessness, by their carelessness. And I hope that these people don't come to any grief. So he too had come away physically from that place, but mentally he was still gone. And this was a big mystery to both of them, that what is it that makes us get away from something angry, frustrated, dejected, and at the same time, we cannot stop thinking about it. At the same time, we want something and we do not want something at the same time. So this was the dilemma they came with. And that is when they go, and then the sage, the rishi named Medhas, he comes out and then greets them and speaks with them. And when the sage comes and asks them, who are you? What do you want? And so then each of them narrates their story to the king. So this is the question then the king asks the sage. So let me read the Sanskrit of how it comes. It comes on verses 41 through 45. Let me begin with the 40th verse. Bhagavam stvamaham prashtum ichhamyekam vadasvatat dukkhaya yanme manasah svachittayat tatam vina mamatvam gatarajyasya rajyangeshvakhileshvapi janatopi yathajnasya kimetan munisattama ayam cha nikritah putrair दारैर् भृत्यैस्तथोज्झितः स्वजनेन च सन्त्यक्तः तेषु हार्दी तथाप्यति एवमेष तथाहं त्वं द्वाप्यत्यन्तदुःखितौ दृष्टदोषेऽपि विषये ममत्वाकृष्टमानसौ. So this is the question the king asks the sage. He says, Revered sir, I wish to ask you one thing. Without control of my thoughts, my mind is coming to grief. I remain possessive towards my lost kingdom and all parts of the realm, as if unaware that they are no longer mine. Venerable sage, how can this be? And this fellow, meaning the merchant who was with him, and this fellow has been humiliated by his children and wife, deserted by his servants, and forsaken by his own people. Still, he feels exceeding affection for them. It is the same with me. We both are distressed to the utmost, held by attachment to things, even though we see their faults. Venerable Sir, how is it that we who should know better can be so deluded? Ours is the perplexity of those who are blind to right understanding. Now, since we have been studying Gita for a while, this looks like a very familiar scenario. We see that Arjuna in the battlefield also had a very similar situation. That he was confused, he was distressed, he didn't know what to do. And while in the Gita, Arjuna approaches Krishna for his guidance and help, here in this book, the king, Suratha, and the merchant, Samadhi, approach the sage, Medhas, for his guidance. Both are confused. Arjuna was confused in the Gita, and here these two, the king and the merchant, are also confused, and they want to know, why is it, what is this power? What is it that makes us think constantly of some people and things, even though we don't want to think about them? What is this power that is so strong? And it is then the sage starts telling them the nature of that power. He identifies that power with the Devi. So here at this point, I would like to say something about power. The word for power in Sanskrit is Shakti. Now, those of us who have been studying Vedanta for some time know that we often use ignorance, avidya, as an important category because it is ignorance that becomes the cause of all the multiplicity. So the general way in which the Vedantic worldview is presented is that there was this one non-dual reality called Brahman. Again, Brahman, you already know, was not a name of that reality. Brahman simply means the infinite. So here is this infinite, undivided reality, and which is so different from our present experience of all these gazillion finite entities filling our experience. So how did these many things in this world, how did this creation, so multifarious, so diverse, how did it come from that one undivided reality? And that transformation, as it were, from that one to the many is explained or described in Vedanta with this intermediate category of ignorance. That ignorance or ajnana is something that happened, seems to have happened, through which this whole creation appeared. And this is one paradigm, one way of understanding things, one framework by which we try to explain how the many came from the one. Now clearly, this being a way of understanding, there is nothing very unique about it, in the sense that There could be other ways of understanding the same reality. There could be other ways of explaining how the many came from the one. And in the tradition in which the goddess become the focus of attention, they introduce the category of power. Think about it this way. Now, we don't generally think about ignorance as power. In Vedanta itself, ignorance is said to have two powers, and the word used is Shakti. So one is the power to conceal, the power to cover, and that is called Avarana Shakti. And the second power of ignorance is the power to project. It's called Vikshepa Shakti. So ignorance has these two powers. We could say, for instance, sleep. Sleep is a form of ignorance because when I'm awake, I'm aware of the world around me. But when I fall asleep, I don't see the world. I have no idea what's happening in the world. As long as I'm sleeping, I'm ignorant of the world. Now, because I'm ignorant of the world, that ignorance is what makes the creation of the dream world possible. So we could say that the power through which the dream world gets created came because of sleep. Because without sleep, I cannot dream. We'll keep daydreams aside for a moment. But we're talking about the dreams that we see at night. So sleep can be seen as embodying power because it is through that power dreams become possible. So in the Shakta tradition, the tradition in which Shakti is the focus of attention, they say that it's the power which makes the many possible. It's the power that is responsible for all creation. Sri Ramakrishna often says that the power and the one who holds that power are not two different entities. And he gives several examples. He says, just as we cannot separate milk and its white color, the whiteness of milk and milk, they are two, well, you could say they are different. The whiteness of milk and milk are two different, and yet you cannot separate them. They are inseparable. Or when a snake moves, the motion of a snake is different from the snake, but you cannot show them differently. Oh, here is the motion and here is the snake. No, they're just one and the same. They are inseparable. You remember in the book Alice in Wonderland, there is the episode about the Cheshire cat. And at one place it is said that the cat was smiling, and gradually the cat disappeared and only the smile remained. Now, it was possible to express it that way in a book of the type of Alice in Wonderland. Well, it's a wonderland. It's a wonderland. And so, just as we cannot separate, if at all the cat could smile, and I'm sure many cat lovers might have seen their cat smile, but if the cat could smile, it would be impossible to separate that smile from the cat. Now, you don't need more examples than that, but exactly in the same way, the power of the Lord, the divine being, and the power of the divine, while they can be distinguished, they cannot be separated. Now, that is the relationship between Brahman and the power of Brahman. Sri Ramakrishna often called that power by the name Kali. In fact, we read in his conversations, he often said that which others call Brahman, I call Kali. Or that Kali and Brahman are not two different entities. They are two different words for the same reality. So there are different ways and in different forms that this idea gets expressed. Once we begin to look at our experience through the framework, through the lens of power or energy, everything begins to make sense. We know that how much of unleashing of energy was necessary even for this material universe to emerge. For every motion, for every activity, there has to be energy, there has to be power behind it. There has to be power in the external world, there has to be power in the internal world. We know even thinking, feeling, all these mental activities also, they need energy, they need power. And we know that our own energy levels determine how much active we can be, physically or mentally or intellectually. And the power we get is primarily from the food that we eat, food, water, all the intakes that we take. And of course, then through more subtle ways, the ideas and all of that. But who is it that feeds us? Who is it that brings us food and water? And especially in the soon after we are born, it's usually our mother or a mother figure in our life who feeds us. And therefore it was easy, very natural for human beings to think about power, and when they thought of power, to look at that power as a mother-like figure. So that is what the sage then tells both the king and the merchant, that this situation in which you find yourself now is because of this great power, that everything that is happening in this world becomes possible because of the presence of that power. And that power, he says, is the power of the goddess. He uses the word Mahamaya, and that's how the Devi is known, specifically in the first chapter, the first section of this book. So, Maha, why is it Maha? Why is this great power? So the power, it's great because it is from this power that this whole cosmos has emerged. So it's not just a tiny little thing. It has cosmic consequences. And therefore the Devi is called that Mahamaya. Now, because this Mahamaya, because the Devi is inseparable from that non-dual reality, the Devi herself is beyond good and evil. But the power that comes from the Devi can manifest in all sorts of ways. Even in the terrible things that happen in this world, there is power. Think about a big tsunami or the wildfires that are raging in the West Coast right now, or earthquakes. Yes, they cause enormous damage, enormous loss of lives, property, and a lot of destruction. But all of these cosmic forces won't be possible without power. So there is a power behind these destructive forces, but there is also power behind all the constructive forces. Love. Love is a power. That's one mistake that people tend to make, is to think of love as emotion, as a feeling. Love is not a feeling. Love is not an emotion. We know there are times when we are very emotional, there are times we are not. There are times when we feel an upsurge of feeling, and there are times when we don't have any, we feel just dry. Now, if love were just a feeling or an emotion, then the love won't be constant. It would come and go. And most of the times when the word love gets thrown about in our day-to-day lives, people often mistake it for an emotion or a feeling. That's why it's not unusual for people to say, oh, I love that thing, I don't love it anymore. Or I love that person, I no longer love that. I hate. Sometimes the very person who is loved becomes an object of hatred. All of these changes, all of these fluctuations occur because we are mistaking something else for love. It's feelings and emotions that come and go. It's feelings and emotions that dry up. Love has a constancy to it. And so therefore love is identified with God. That's why people say God is love. That's why we identified it with the Divine Mother. That because love is primarily a power. So the power to love, the power to feel, the power to think. So even in these inner world of ours, there is power needed. So the great I, the big I, is this I of the cosmic being. Now, all of us have our own little I. So the same power of the divine gets funneled through my little ego and gets expressed through my body and mind. And because my mind is tainted, because my mind hasn't become crystal clear, pure yet, because my mind has its own biases and prejudices, the power that comes out of it is colored by the way the mind is colored. And therefore, individually, when people use that power, it can get used for good or for bad. So, power itself is neutral, but the way that power manifests, we then refer to that power as good power or bad power. But that what makes it good or bad is not the power itself, but the medium through which that power gets used. And therefore, this little I, what Ramakrishna called the unripe I, is what makes good and evil possible in this world. Is the same power, the divine power, getting funneled through my own little ego and my own colored mind and body that creates this duality, this polarity of good and evil, love and hatred in the world in which we live. So what the sage tells the king and the merchant, is that at present, this is what is happening to you. The power, you are under the hold of that power. Now, it's a cosmic power. So then he tells them a story of how this power functions, how this power manifests. And the story is about Mahavishnu, the Lord. And the story says that between two cycles of creation, so whenever the world is projected, there is this creation. For a while, it is sustained, and then afterwards it's withdrawn back into that cosmic reality. So in Sanskrit, they call it Srishti, Sthiti, and Pralaya. So creation, sustenance, and absorption. And then after this, there is a period of quiet after that absorption. And then once again, there is creation, sustenance, absorption. So there is a cycle. So creation, as seen in many of the Eastern traditions, is not a one-time event. It's cyclical. Things come, remain for a while, go back to their constituents. It's almost like recycling. And then again, they emerge, again stay for a while, again go back. Again they emerge and go on. So that's how it is. So the story that actually this book begins by saying, on the eighth cycle, whichever way they began counting it, the story occurs. That's when it's a part of a Purana called Markandeya Purana. So it's a story being told by Markandeya. And in that story, then he narrates this tale about the king, the merchant, and the sage. And now the sage, it's a story within a story. The sage is now telling these two of his visitors how this power manifests. So he said, between these two cycles of creation, when the universe was at rest, it's often signified in mythology as Lord Vishnu just resting on this 1,000-headed serpent called Shesha. So Vishnu is in deep sleep, and from his navel, a stalk comes out, and there is this lotus on which Brahma, the creator, the creative aspect of the divine, is sitting on that lotus which has emerged from the navel of Vishnu, who is asleep. Now at that time, two demons, very ferocious demons, called Madhu and Kaitabha, that's the names of these two demons, they come and threaten, come and attack Brahma. And Brahma is terrified. Brahma doesn't know what to do. And the Lord is asleep. What the book says is that sleep, remember we said earlier, the sleep is a power. And so Vishnu, who is asleep, the Devi, the power of sleep, is on his eyelids. Remember, when we are asleep, of course, most of us, I think, keep our eyes closed when we are asleep. So our eyelids are closed, and the Devi is sitting there. And so he tries to call out to Vishnu and says, these demons have come. Something needs to be done. But Vishnu is asleep. Now, he cannot wake up until the Devi, who is responsible for their sleep, she is propitiated. And so then the Brahma then sings a beautiful hymn to propitiate the Devi and seeking her grace. It's a beautiful hymn. We'll see very shortly what it is. And then when the Devi is propitiated, she arises from the eyelids. Vishnu opens his eyes. He sees the two demons, and then we read that a big combat ensues. The book says that the fight between Vishnu and the two demons went on for 5,000 years. That might seem like a lot, but in this cosmic scale of things, 5,000 isn't much. So 5,000 years the combat went on, and still there was no conclusion. So these two demons, who I guess they were not so sure they might be able to last for so long. So when they found that the Lord himself could not finish them off for 5,000 years, they were still standing and fighting, something happened within them, and then they very generously told the Lord, looks like you are not able to do anything. So we give you a boon, ask whatever you want. Now this seems outrageous. They are fighting, they are on the opposite sides, but such is the pride that enters into these demons, like we cannot be conquered. We are unique. And so out of the fullness of their heart, they say, ask for any boon that you want. And then, of course, Vishnu smiles and says, okay, he says, I just want to kill you. And he says, what other boon in this situation, what other boon can anyone ask for? And of course, then he takes them on his, both these asuras, puts them on his thighs and slaughters them. There is a pun used in this text. So there is what happens is when these demons tell him, ask any boon that you want, and he says, well, I want to finish you off. Of course, by that time, then they suddenly realize that it was a bad idea to have offered the boon to him. But oddly enough, unlike some of the people as we see today, and as most human beings would do, that when the situation becomes inconvenient, they backtrack, they don't keep their words, they forget their promises. These demons don't do that. So they say, well, we offered him a boon, so we really kind of brought this upon ourselves. So they want to honor the boon that they have given. But then they say, okay, but here is a caveat, that you can only kill us on a space where there is no water. So the word that is used in Sanskrit for that is urvi. Remember, it was the time when there was entire creation was absorbed. So there was just water everywhere. And Krishna, and the Lord is resting on this undifferentiated ocean of water, on this 1,000-headed serpent. So water everywhere. And now how do you find a space where there is no water? Because that's the only place he can kill the two demons. Now, the word, as I said, for that is urvi. Now, urvi also means a thigh. The same word also means a thigh. So that's the pun that is used. And so Vishnu says, sure, I can do that. And he just lifts them up, puts them on his thighs, and slaughters them. The text points out that it's the Devi, the goddess, which sat in the form of sleep on the eyelids of Vishnu. It is the Devi whose power created that power of attachment in the king and the merchant, that in spite of the betrayal, in spite of the dejection, their heart was still longing, they were still thinking about the very people they had run away from. And it is the same power that entered into the mind of these demons in the form of this pride, which made them do such a absolutely foolish thing of offering a boon to their enemy. Now, all of these things happened because of the power of the Devi. And it was the propitiating of the Devi that removed the menace of these two demons. So the hymn that is here, so there is this, let me read to you that there are 3 or 4 very beautiful verses here. Verses 55 through 58 goes like this. Jnaninam api chetamsi Devi Bhagavati Hisab Baladakrishya Mohaya Mahamaya Prayachati Taya Visrujjate Vishwam Jagadetat Characharam Saisha Prasanna Varada Nrinam Bhavati Muktaye Savitya Parama Mukter Hetu Bhuta Sanatani Samsara Bandha Hetuscha Saiva Sarveshwareshwari, which means she, the blessed goddess Mahamaya, seizes the minds of even the wise and draws them into delusion. She creates all this universe, moving and unmoving, and it is she who graciously bestows liberation on humanity. She is the supreme knowledge and the eternal cause of liberation. Even as she is the cause of bondage to this transitory existence, she is the sovereign of all lords. So, what the book presents us is a way of looking at everything as a manifestation of power, manifestation of Shakti. The more we become aware of the power outside us, the power inside us, we recognize that unless we are able to use this power responsibly, unless we are able to use this power carefully, we are going to get into trouble. It's like a powerful weapon. A powerful weapon given in the hand of someone who is not trained for it, someone who is reckless, will use that weapon for destruction. But if someone knows how to use it responsibly, how to use it well, then the same instrument can do wonderful things. And a simple example clearly is just the knife. A knife in the hands of a murderer, in the hands of a person who is either deranged or who has a lot of hatred or anger, that knife can take away someone's life. But knife in the hand of a surgeon who knows how to use it well, how to use it responsibly, the same knife can save a life. Exactly in the same way, power in the hands of a careless, reckless person will produce pain and suffering. But power in the hands of a careful, wise person can actually destroy that suffering, remove that suffering, and bring joy. And the source of all that power, the power itself, is the goddess. And therefore, if we can propitiate that goddess, if we can somehow find a way to receive that power within us and use it through a purified mind, then that same power can be a source of immense bliss to us. So there is a lot that we will see going forward about the goddess as power next Sunday and a Sunday after that as well. So we'll have a 5-minute break now, and then if you have any thoughts, ideas, comments, questions, we will take a look. So please give some thought to it, and we'll meet in 5 minutes. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. So let us take a look at some of the questions. In some Vedantic frameworks, we see Maya as something to overcome, but when thought of as Shakti, we should worship it. How do we reconcile these two approaches? I don't think we need to reconcile everything, but there is a possibility to see the similarities here. Even when we worship Shakti, it's to propitiate that Shakti. So it's personifying that power. And when that Shakti is propitiated, she gets out of the way. In other words, we are able to go beyond the manifestation of Shakti. And beyond that point, if we still want to think of her as Shakti, we are still free to do so. That is what the worshippers of the Devi see, that just as in Vedanta they speak about Brahman as personal and impersonal, the worshippers of Devi also see her as Devi in a personal aspect and Devi as an impersonal. So at that point, whether we call that one reality as Devi or Shakti or Brahman, it really doesn't matter what name we give that reality. It's enough to know that if we see it in in a Vedantic way, it's ignorance, then we say, I need knowledge to remove that ignorance. If we look at it in a different framework, we see that as the Shakti, then we say we propitiate that Shakti, and through Shakti's grace, the path, the door to liberation is open to us. We don't necessarily have to zigzag between these two ways of thinking. Whichever of these ways feels natural and feels something that we are able to connect with, we can do it. Either of these ways is equally effective. So it's really it's not even so much an individual choice in the sense that it's not something intellectually driven. Sometimes you will see, we will read all these different ways of thinking and imagining, and one of these ways will suddenly say, oh yeah, somehow I like this. And you yourself may not know why one way makes better sense than another way. And it's fine. Whichever of these ways one finds meaningful, one can follow. It's again also not necessarily an either or situation. There could be times when the mind feels like thinking in terms of Brahman and Maya. There may be times in which one mind might think in terms of the Divine Mother, opening the door to freedom. And both are equally fine. And when we pray to Shakti for goodness, do we pray to the constructive part of Brahman? Well, Brahman does not really have a constructive part and a destructive part. So Brahman has no parts really. So when we pray to Shakti, what we are praying for, irrespective of whichever way we phrase our prayer, whichever way we do it, what we are really praying for is that I become a careful, responsible user of that power. Because the power has come to us, it's already there within us. Right now, even at this very moment, we wouldn't be living if there was no power within us. So there is physical energy, there is mental energy, all these energies are already within us. What we are praying for when we pray to Shakti is the ability to use this power responsibly, the ability to be able to see things in a clear way so that we use this power in a way which will produce happiness for us and for people around us. We use this power in such a way that will help remove our own pain and the pain of other people around us. That's what we pray for. Next question. Should we think of our spiritual practices as an offering to the Devi so that she might let us open our eyes to the true reality? Well, that's really would be a good way to do that. Sure. But in this story, when Vishnu wakes up, the demon should have disappeared. Or maybe there isn't a parallel here. No, there is no parallel here. As I said, this story is a myth. And a myth sometimes is able to convey some of the truths which a purely historical narrative cannot do. So here, the opening of Vishnu's eyes doesn't necessarily mean the end of the dream, not in the way we think about in Vedanta. The creation story of Vishnu sleeping, suddenly these Rakshasas coming out of nowhere, resembles how we fall asleep and see crazy things in our dreams emerge out of nowhere. Well, that's true. I think I like this analogy, except that, as the earlier questioner pointed out, when Vishnu opens his eyes, the demons are still there, so they haven't vanished. So there the analogy breaks a little bit. Ignorance being power, how can we gain knowledge of ignorance so it can help us? Knowledge is also power. So if ignorance is power, knowledge is power. And that's why knowledge can remove ignorance. Both are powers, and one power can subdue another power. If knowledge is seen as a power of light, ignorance is the power of darkness. And we know that light removes darkness. next question is, what is the root problem? Ignorance or sense of ego? Actually, the two are connected. Ego is one of the first products of ignorance. When there is this one undivided reality, that has no ego. Ego is the sense of I. The sense of I can exist only in the presence of not I. If everything is just one, and I doesn't exist. I cannot exist. I is a way of separating, distinguishing myself from other things. And if there are no other things, no other beings, then the ego doesn't exist. So ignorance and ego do go together. So you could say that the ego is one of the first manifestations of ignorance. If power is funneled through the little I, is what results in good or bad, shouldn't we focus more on understanding our little I than power that is pure and out of our control? Sure, that's a good point. But even to make an effort to understand needs power. So we just cannot ignore power. Even our effort to understand the little I will need power. Even to understand power, we need power. To see our little I, we need power. So, yeah, I totally accept the point that we do need to look at this little I. What is it that makes that I little? What is it? What are the kind of mischiefs that can occur if that I continues to be little and petty, and try to find ways to expand that I consciousness? But in order to do all of that, we need power, both clarity of understanding, and understanding is also a form of power. So power is something we cannot ignore at all. When the mind is stilled in waking state, do we experience pure consciousness? Yes. The stilling of the mind really means disappearance of the mind. But disappearance, I mean, you don't feel it. It's a little bit like the stilling of the body. One way of looking at that is that if we feel something, it is still getting in the way. For instance, now when we try to sit for meditation, and oftentimes in the beginning, although we think that, oh, I'm thinking of God or I'm meditating on God, but in the initial stages of meditation, it's really a struggle. And oftentimes not even a struggle with the mind, it's really a struggle with the body. So one of the first things that people have to struggle with in meditation is just finding the right posture. As long as we have not found that ideal posture, and there is no one ideal posture for everyone. Our constitutions are different. The way our body is accustomed to sitting or folding their legs or the back, it's very unique for every one of us. So it takes a while to find the right posture, because until we have not found it, after every few seconds or a few minutes, you might want to adjust your posture a little bit. You feel some twitching in your shoulder or in your knee. So as long as the body is making its presence felt, as long as the body has not, so to speak, disappeared from my consciousness, it is an obstruction. It's an obstacle. How can I be thinking of God if at the same time I'm having a sensation in my toes, or in my knees, or in my shoulder, or in my neck muscles? So my attention is being demanded by the body. And so making the body, so to speak, disappear from my consciousness is when I have perfectly found a posture, the body demands no attention at all. Then the struggle begins with the mind. then the mind is running here and there, thinking about the past, thinking about the future, and all kinds of things. So the mind then gets in the way. Now, if I'm struggling with the mind, I cannot be simultaneously thinking of God. So the mind has to get out of the way. So only when the body and the mind get out of the way, if not totally, at least mostly, only then do we have the freedom and the privilege to think about our chosen deity, to think about whichever way we are accustomed to thinking of God. And so, yes, when the mind is still in the waking state, we do experience pure consciousness. But stilling of the mind and stilling of the body is really a way of the body and mind disappearing from our field of consciousness. And only then the truth or the being will stand shining. Next question. How is the story of Ma Durga fighting and defeating Mahishasura related to this beautiful story of Vishnu fighting and defeating the two demons? The story of the Devi fighting Mahishasura will come next Sunday. I said in the beginning that this book, Chandi, has 3 sections. So what we saw today is the first section, in which this Devi, who is the force for the good, fighting off the forces of evil in the form of these 2 demons, Madhu and Kaitaba. Next Sunday, when we will study the second chapter, that is where the Devi will fight the evil, and the evil there comes in the form of the Mahishasura, the buffalo demon. So that will be a different story. The Devi is the same, but the demons will be different. So we come to the end of the comments and questions for today. We will continue to study this text. Next Sunday when we meet, we will look at the second section. The first section is called the Prathama Charitra. The second section is called the Madhyama Charitra. And then the last section will come on a Sunday after that. So we will conclude now with a prayer. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto you.